So, if you want to permanently, and I mean irrevocably, sear a new piece of information into an adult's brain, do not give them flashcards.
Right, definitely no flashcard.
No, do not give them a quiet room, and definitely do not give them a comfortable chair. You have to terrify them.
Which, it sounds incredibly counterintuitive when we think about modern education.
Mhm.
But from a neurological standpoint, inducing a state of acute dread might actually be one of the most efficient ways to force the human brain to retain vocabulary.
And that biological glitch basically is the focal point of our deep dive today. So for you listening, we are looking at a piece of audio source material titled The House at the End of the Street.
Yeah, it's from a series called Bedtime Story Learning English, episode 4, I believe.
Right, episode 4. Now, on the surface, those two concepts, like a bedtime story and an English language lesson, they're supposed to be the safest, most emotionally low-stakes environments imaginable.
Oh, absolutely. You expect these soothing cadences and, really basic foundational sentences like, the apple is red, or where is the library?
Exactly.
Because conventional wisdom dictates that when the cognitive load of learning a new language is really high, the emotional load needs to be kept as low as possible.
Right, to avoid overwhelming the student.
Exactly. You want the learner completely relaxed so they don't just, shut down.
But the author of this specific story decided to take that soothing foundational structure of a beginner's language lesson and just violently smash it into a terrifying supernatural thriller.
It really is an educational Trojan horse.
It totally is. So whether you, the listener, are actively trying to learn a new language, or you're just, I don't know, a diehard fan of psychological horror, we're going to unpack how this story masterfully manipulates your emotions.
It rewires your memory, yeah.
Yes, rewires your memory using only the absolute most basic elemental building blocks of the English language.
Because we really need to analyze this not just as a ghost story, but as a deliberate mechanism of linguistic manipulation.
Right.
The author is using beginner vocabulary, meaning they cannot rely on complex Gothic prose to scare you. They don't have those words available.
So they have to build this architecture of dread using only elementary words.
Exactly, which forces them to tap into much deeper, more primal psychological triggers.
Which brings us to the baseline of normality the story establishes right before it starts tearing everything down.
Setting the scene.
Yeah, setting the scene. So we are introduced to our main characters, Alex and Sarah. They are moving into a new apartment. And the audio production gives us very mundane sound design, like a moving truck, boxes shifting around.
Just everyday noises.
Right. There's a bit of dry banter about which box contains the kitchen supplies. They note the street is quiet, the neighbors seem friendly, and crucially, Alex points out that the rent is very cheap.
Let's isolate that phrase, actually.
Very cheap.
If we look at it through the lens of a language learner, for a beginner, cheap is one of the very first economic concepts you memorize.
Oh, for sure.
And it generally carries a positive connotation. But narratively, the author is using this elementary phrase to plant a massive psychological red flag.
It's brilliant.
By placing something highly desirable, cheap rent, in an otherwise flawless environment, the text introduces this immediate dissonance.
It is the ultimate horror trope, really, but it works perfectly. Finding extremely cheap rent on a quiet, beautiful street is like, well, it's like walking through a park and finding a flawless, untouched piece of artisanal chocolate cake just sitting alone on a park bench.
Okay, I see the imagery you're going for there.
Right.
But let's dig into why that specific scenario bothers the human brain so much. It isn't just that the cake is out of place. It's about context stripping.
Context stripping, right.
Because a piece of cake in a bakery, that's commerce. A piece of cake on a kitchen counter, domestic. But a piece of cake sitting on a park bench with no owner visible completely strips the object of its logical context. The brain cannot resolve the why.
Wait, actually, let me take that further. The brain doesn't just fail to resolve the why. It actively defaults to suspicion.
Yes.
Your survival instincts kick in. Like, why is that cake there? Who left it? What is wrong with the ingredients?
You start assuming the worst.
You do not eat the park bench cake. And you do not sign the lease on the suspiciously cheap apartment without assuming there is a hidden cost.
Yet, human pragmatism often overrides that instinct, The relief of finding affordable housing completely blinds Alex and Sarah to the missing context.
It's true.
But the narrator doesn't let the audience stay blind. Almost immediately, the text directs Alex's attention down the street, highlighting the stark visual contrasts of the neighborhood.
Right. He notices the house at the end of the street. And here is where the constraint of beginner English really shows its teeth.
Absolutely.
Because the author can't use words like dilapidated or looming or sinister or overgrown. The vocabulary list provided for this lesson just doesn't include high-level adjectives.
So how do you create an atmosphere of rot with a restricted toolbox? You rely on binary visual contrasts.
For the black and white of it all.
Exactly. The text describes the other houses in the neighborhood as new and clean with bright flowers.
Very pleasant.
Right. But the house at the end of the street is described using only fundamental terms: dark, black windows, no curtains, dead grass, and black trees.
And it requires almost zero linguistic complexity for a non-native speaker to understand bright flowers versus dead grass. But psychologically, it hits like a sledgehammer.
Because it triggers our evolutionary pattern recognition software.
Right.
As a species, we are wired to seek symmetry and health in our environment. When an environment is uniformly vibrant, the introduction of a single, localized point of decay, like black trees amidst bright flowers, signals a pathogen.
Pathogen. Wow.
Yeah, the brain interprets the house not just as old, but as a literal source of infection. The elementary vocabulary strips away all the poetic romance you might find in a traditional Gothic novel, and it just leaves you with the raw, clinical presence of disease.
Sarah tries to rationalize it, though. She says, maybe nobody lives there.
Typical horror protagonist denial.
Totally. But Alex pushes back. He says it feels strange, like the house is watching them. And Sarah delivers that classic line of mundane reassurance. She says, houses do not watch people. Right. As a seasoned horror fan, hearing that just makes you wince. You just want to yell at the audio player. In this genre, they absolutely do.
It's dramatic irony delivered through foundational syntax. The listener knows something the characters refuse to acknowledge.
Yes.
But what elevates this from a simple visual warning to genuine psychological terror is how the narrative transitions. Once the story establishes that the house looks like a pathogen, it immediately shifts to making the house sound wrong.
Which brings us to their first night in the apartment. The story transitions into the witching hour, basically. 3:00 a.m.
The classic spooky hour.
Always 3:00 a.m. Sarah wakes up, pulling Alex out of sleep because she hears something outside, and the sound design drops everything except a heavy, quiet wind. And then, very faintly, Sarah hears old music, like a music box.
Notice how the audio production manipulates the listener here. At the very beginning of this lesson, the narrator explicitly instructs you to turn off the lights and get comfortable.
Setting the mood.
Exactly. It forces you to rely entirely on your hearing. The production then uses auditory deprivation. It fades from mysterious introductory music down to a single cricket, and finally into an oppressive silence.
It forces you to lean forward. You are straining your ears just to pick up the baseline of the environment.
Right. And by depriving you of ambient noise, any auditory intrusion feels violently invasive.
Oh, for sure.
And choosing a music box as that intrusion is just a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. A music box is an object of childhood. It represents innocence and comfort, but play out of context in the dead of night from an abandoned dead property.
Let me stop you right there, actually, because I've been trying to figure out the mechanics of this specific scare.
Okay.
Why is a faint melody from a music box infinitely more terrifying than a loud crash? In so much horror media, the jump scare is a slamming door or breaking glass. But those just startle me. The faint music box makes my skin crawl on a completely different level.
It's unnerving.
Is it just the trope of corrupted childhood innocence, or is there something mechanical happening?
Well, think about the physics involved.
Yeah.
What causes a loud crash? Entropy. Gravity. Wind. Maybe the natural decay of an old structure settling.
They're natural forces.
Exactly. A loud crash is the universe moving toward disorder, which, while startling, is entirely natural. A crash can be an accident.
Oh, wow. A music box cannot be an accident.
Precisely. A music box requires mechanical intervention. It requires gears to be wound.
Yeah.
It requires a deliberate injection of order into a chaotic environment.
That's so creepy when you put it like that.
Hearing a music box means that an invisible hand has taken a conscious, intentional action in the dark. It implies an unseen intelligence.
Intentionality. That is terrifying. It isn't just the house settling. Something is actively turning a crank.
Yes.
And when Alex looks out the window, he gets visual confirmation of that intelligence. He sees a single light turned on in the top floor of that supposedly empty, dead house.
And then the narrative doubles down on this manipulation of sound the following morning. When they actually walk down the street toward the property, the text makes a point to note that the sounds of birds and insects they had been hearing are completely gone.
It goes from auditory intrusion to an absolute auditory vacuum, a dead zone. It's as if even the wildlife recognizes an instinctual boundary that the humans are just too curious to respect.
And that boundary pushes the characters into the next phase of the narrative. The eerie phenomena of the night force them to seek logical answers.
Right.
Those answers arrive practically the moment the sun comes up, knocking on their front door.
Enter Mrs. Gray from number 7. The text is very sparse but highly specific with her physical description. She is small, she has white hair, and she has strange, pale eyes.
Very striking image.
Definitely. Alex mentions the light they saw in the window the night before, and Mrs. Gray immediately establishes an ironclad authority. She doesn't entertain his observation at all. She just says, there was no light. That house has had no electricity for 30 years.
She serves the classic archetype of the harbinger.
Oh, yeah.
In literature, the harbinger is the local fixture who understands the immutable rules of the supernatural environment and delivers the warning. But let's look at how she delivers that warning, because this is where the English lesson becomes brilliant.
The way she speaks to them is so unsettlingly formal.
Yes. She doesn't yell, she doesn't scream, stay away or you'll die. Instead, she relies on modal verbs. She tells them, I would strongly suggest that you do not look at that house at night, and I would strongly suggest that you never go near it.
I would strongly suggest it sounds like an HR reprimand, not a supernatural warning.
Right.
Why does that polite phrasing feel so much more threatening than a direct command?
Let's break down the morphology. An imperative command like, do not go near the house, sets up a direct ego conflict between the speaker and the listener.
Okay, I'm with you.
It is a test of wills. It implies an authority that the listener can choose to defy. But Mrs. Gray uses the conditional. I would strongly suggest. The unstated second half of that sentence is, if you wish to survive. By phrasing it as a polite suggestion, she removes her own ego from the equation entirely.
Oh, she isn't giving an order. She's informing them of a law of physics, like saying, I would strongly suggest you don't step off that cliff.
Exactly.
Gravity doesn't care if you obey. The house doesn't care if you obey.
That is exactly the linguistic function. For a beginner English learner, teaching modal verbs like would and could can be incredibly dry.
Super boring, usually.
Yeah. But by wrapping it in the context of a life or death warning, the author demonstrates how formal, polite language can carry infinitely more menace than a shouted threat.
Which brings me to how people react to harbingers in horror. I always compare characters like Mrs. Gray to human caution tape. You know, the bright yellow tape wrapped around an open manhole.
That's a great analogy.
In horror stories, protagonists inevitably duck right under the caution tape. But logically, if a pale-eyed woman knocks on your door the day you move in and calmly informs you that the house next door defies the laws of electricity, isn't that the moment you break the lease?
You'd think so.
You pack the boxes back into the truck, forfeit your security deposit, and drive away.
Rational self-preservation would demand it. But narrative progression requires human curiosity to override that caution. And Mrs. Gray hooks both the characters and the listener by delivering the lore of the house.
The backstory.
Right. She provides the history of the White family, the father, the mother, Thomas, and Lily.
She frames their disappearance as the ultimate locked room mystery. One night in 1962, they simply vanished. The doors were locked from the inside, nothing was stolen. The table was set for dinner, and the food was still warm.
And here, the author is using beginner vocabulary to construct a highly sophisticated horror trope.
Yeah.
The locked room mystery is inherently unsettling because it removes the possibility of external logic. If the doors are locked from the inside, the threat wasn't an intruder. The threat was already inside the ecosystem.
It's trapped in there with them.
Right. Furthermore, juxtaposing the deeply domestic image of warm food and a set table with complete, inexplicable human erasure creates a profound cognitive dissonance.
It's like someone hit pause on reality, and then Mrs. Gray drops the statistical anchor that really grounds the danger. She counts on her fingers, literally. Since that night in 1962, 7 people have gone inside that house. None of them came back out.
Such a chilling moment.
Sarah asks, almost whispering, none of them. And Mrs. Gray just replies, welcome to the neighborhood, and walks away.
It is a devastatingly cold departure. But her initial warning only provides the history of the danger. It is her second visit to their apartment that reveals the actual mechanics of the threat. She doesn't just leave him with a mystery. She returns to explain what is inside the house.
Yeah, she brings them a physical artifact, the diary of 14-year-old Thomas White, the son who vanished.
Using a diary in horror acts as a temporal bridge. It collapses the distance between 1962 and the present day, allowing the past victim to speak directly to the current potential victims.
She reads the final entry, dated November 14th. Thomas writes that something has been in the house with them for days. He says it stands in the corners watching them eat dinner, and tonight it feels very close.
So creepy.
But the real gut punch is Mrs. Gray's explanation of the entity itself. She says it has no name, but it feeds on warmth, on light, and on love. A family full of happiness is exactly what it wanted.
And this is a brilliant subversion of supernatural tropes, because in the vast majority of ghost stories, a haunting is catalyzed by trauma. A murder, a betrayal, a terrible crime that stains the location.
Right, the classic angry ghost.
Exactly. The spirit is vengeful. It wants to inflict pain.
But this entity isn't angry. It's an emotional parasite.
And the distinction Mrs. Gray makes here is arguably the most vital linguistic lesson in the entire text. Sarah asks, horrified, and it took them. And Mrs. Gray corrects her. She says, it kept them. There is a difference.
Kept, not taken. That single verb completely rewrites the horror dynamic.
Let's analyze the grammar of those two words. Taken implies removal. It implies being killed, destroyed, or transported away from the physical realm.
Okay.
But kept implies possession. It implies maintenance and stasis. It shifts the horror from the fear of death to the psychological terror of being frozen in place, utilized as a permanent resource.
Wow. It's treating them like a battery pack.
Exactly, yeah, like a battery pack.
But let me challenge the core nature of this entity for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
If we look at the text objectively, this thing specifically feeds on warmth, light, love, and a happy family dinner. Is it actually malicious? Usually evil in these stories wants to cause suffering. Is it possible this entity is just a starving, cold creature drawn to their warmth, the exact same way a freezing person lost in the woods is drawn to a campfire?
That's an interesting perspective.
A freezing person doesn't hate the fire, they just need it to survive. The entity doesn't hate the White family, it literally feeds on their love.
I see where you go with the campfire analogy, but I think it falls apart when you look at the entity's methodology.
How so?
Well, a freezing traveler stumbles upon a fire, warms their hands, and eventually the fire burns out. This entity doesn't just consume ambient heat. It alters the physical environment, locking doors from the inside, freezing time to ensure the fire never burns out.
Oh, I see.
It isn't a passive traveler. It's a parasite establishing a permanent closed-loop ecosystem. It wants the family suspended in an eternal state of producing warmth. Whether it feels malice or just hunger is irrelevant to the host. The outcome is a horrific, engineered stasis.
That fundamentally shifts the horror from destruction to forced preservation.
Yeah.
And despite knowing this history, despite understanding that the house is an engineered trap for an emotional parasite, human curiosity pushes Alex and Sarah to break the rules.
Of course it does.
They decide to approach the house.
And Sarah explicitly states she is only going with Alex to stop him from doing something stupid.
Right.
But as they walk down the street, the environment shifts again. The wind stops. The birds are gone. And when they reach the property line, they find the heavy black iron gate is wide open.
They walk up the path of dead grass, and they see the front door is also open. The text says, just a few centimeters.
Consider how the physical environment is acting as bait. A locked door is a barrier. It tells the intruder to stay out. An open door, specifically one cracked just a few centimeters, is an invitation.
It draws you in.
It pulls the eye inward. The entity, or the house itself, senses their presence. It is minimizing the friction required for them to step inside and become the next meal.
They look through the front window. They can see down the hallway, past the old wallpaper, straight to the dining table. And Sarah becomes breathless. She says, the plates are still there after all these years, like they were waiting for dinner.
It's the visual confirmation of Mrs. Gray's lore. The domestic tableau frozen for 60 years cements the reality of the danger.
And then the climax of the scene hits. Sarah grabs Alex's arm and looks up at the top floor window, the same window where the light was on at 3 a.m.
The tension here is amazing.
There is a shape, a figure standing completely still, looking down at them. It's Thomas. 14 years old, utterly unchanged since 1962. They stand paralyzed for 5 seconds. Then Sarah says, it just moved. It moved closer to the glass.
How does Alex react? Does he scream? Does he run?
This is my absolute favorite part of the story. He doesn't scream. He grips her arm and says, in these incredibly short staccato sentences, walk. Walk now. Don't run. Just walk.
That sequence is a masterclass in pacing. The author uses the absolute simplest grammatical structures, imperative verbs, to mirror the physiological heart rate of a high-stress encounter.
It's so visceral.
But more importantly, the characters show immense restraint. In almost any other piece of horror media, the protagonist would go inside, they would try to investigate the plates, they would go upstairs to help the boy, and they would trigger the trap.
But Alex and Sarah keep their promise to each other. They said they were only going to look, and they stick to it. Alex's command to walk, don't run, reminds me of the biological advice for encountering an apex predator, like a bear in the woods.
Let's trace that biology, actually. What happens when you encounter a bear?
Every single evolutionary instinct in your nervous system floods your body with adrenaline and screams at you to turn around and sprint as fast as you physically can. But if you run, you trigger the predator's innate prey drive. The bear will chase you, and it will catch you. It takes a superhuman level of willpower to look a predator in the eye and slowly, deliberately walk backward.
Because running implies prey behavior. It signals to the predator that you are weak and vulnerable to capture. Walking implies control, even if that control is entirely a facade.
Fake it till you make it, basically.
Exactly. Alex instinctively understands that sprinting away in a panic will trigger the entity's feeding mechanism. They had to back away from the campfire before the cold can grab them. The author brilliantly uses the beginner vocabulary constraints, walk, don't run, to perfectly encapsulate complex survival biology.
And they survive. They make it back to their apartment by simply walking away. But the story doesn't end with that adrenaline spike. It leaves you, the listener, with a profound emotional realization about the family trapped inside. The next morning, the tone completely shifts from visceral horror to quiet grief.
Yes, Sarah is drinking her coffee, looking out the window at the dark house, and she is overwhelmed with pity. She realizes Thomas has been trapped as a 14-year-old boy for over 6 decades. She expresses a desire to help them.
Alex, playing the role of the logical pragmatist, immediately shoots that down. He reminds her of the body count. 7 people went in, none came out. He represents pure survival logic. Sarah represents empathy.
But Sarah doesn't argue that they should break into the house. Instead, she looks toward the property and speaks aloud into the quiet street. She says, "Thomas, I hope you can hear us. We know you are there. We have not forgotten you."
And the environment actually reacts. The text notes that the wind moves gently, and somewhere in the house, a curtain in the top window shifts. Just slightly, as if someone or something heard her. Even Alex softens. He says, "We will find a way. Someday." And the narrator tells us the street is still, but somehow less cold than before.
This thematic resolution is remarkable for an English lesson. The curse of the house is not broken. There is no violent confrontation.
No boss fight.
Right. Nobody brings in a priest for an exorcism. Nobody finds old bones hidden in the walls and salts them to release the spirits.
All the mechanical resolutions we expect from the genre are ignored. But I have to admit, I struggle with the morality of this ending.
Really? Why?
Is what Sarah did actually kind? Think about it practically. Is it actually cruel to stand safely behind your own locked door, look at a house where a teenager has been suffering since 1962, and say, "We haven't forgotten you, but we're too scared to actually come over there and save you right now. Hang in there." It feels like offering thoughts and prayers to a haunting.
That's a highly cynical reading, but I understand the friction you're feeling. However, let's look at it strictly within the internal logic established by the text. What does the entity feed on?
Warmth, light, and love.
Right. If Sarah and Alex allow their empathy to override their logic, if they go inside out of love and a desire to help Thomas, what happens?
Ah, I see.
They don't save him. They simply become more fuel for the parasite. They get added to the battery pack.
So action is actually self-defeating.
Completely. By acknowledging Thomas from a safe distance, Sarah provides a spark of humanity. The core tragedy of the White family, according to Mrs. Gray, was their erasure. No explanation, no goodbye. Sarah undoes that erasure. She bears witness to his pain without stepping into the trap to be consumed by it.
That makes sense.
The narrator explicitly tells the listener in the outro that some stories do not have easy endings and some mysteries stay unsolved. The narrative argument is that bearing witness has inherent value. Even if it doesn't yield a rescue, it makes the street less cold.
That is a much more philosophically comforting way to look at it. But as we unpack all of this, the philosophy of empathy, the survival biology of walking away, the linguistics of modal verbs, we have to confront the grand design of the source material. Every single narrative beat we just analyzed serves a secondary hidden purpose.
Yes.
This whole story is a mechanism designed to teach English.
The educational meta layer. We touched on it earlier, but it is the connective tissue of the entire experience.
The text is explicitly framed as an educational tool. At the very end of the audio, the narrator drops the story and provides a literal vocabulary list. Words like curtain, electricity, disappeared, convincingly, adjust, breathless, reflection, supernatural, feeds on.
Very specific words.
And the source even includes Bengali translations for the target demographic. And the narrator concludes the audio by soothing the listener, telling them to take a slow breath, assuring them they are safe and warm and that whatever is in the dark cannot reach them in their bed.
From a cognitive science perspective, leveraging fear as a pedagogical tool is fiercely effective. We typically view education as a sterile intellectual exercise, rote memorization, repetition, flashcards. But human memory doesn't prioritize sterile information.
It really doesn't.
No, memory is deeply tied to the amygdala, the emotional processing center of the brain.
Let's dig into that mechanism. How exactly does the amygdala encode a vocabulary word better than a flashcard?
It comes down to state-dependent learning and neurochemistry. When you experience fear or intense suspense, your brain releases a cocktail of hormones, primarily adrenaline and cortisol.
The fight or flight juice.
Exactly. This heightened state of physiological arousal sends a massive signal to the hippocampus, the region responsible for memory formation. It essentially yells at the brain, whatever's happening in our environment right now is critical for our survival, so you must record it permanently.
Evolutionarily, that makes sense. If you encounter a predator near a specific watering hole, your brain ensures you never, ever forget the layout of that watering hole.
Exactly. Now apply that to language acquisition. You aren't just learning the English word breathless by reading it translated on a whiteboard. You are hearing the word breathless at the exact moment. Sarah realizes the plates have been sitting on the dining table for 60 years, and a frozen entity appears in the window above her.
You feel it.
Yes. The listener's physiological reaction, the held breath, the spike in heart rate, becomes intrinsically linked to the neural pathway storing the English word. The emotional context encodes the vocabulary in a way repetition simply cannot match.
It's brilliant. I keep coming back to the analogy of a parent hiding pureed vegetables inside a rich, spicy pasta sauce.
It's the perfect analogy.
As a language learner, you are so intensely focused on the thrill of the narrative, the flavor of the ghost story, the suspense of whether Alex and Sarah are going to walk into the baited trap, that you don't even realize your brain is quietly digesting all these complex linguistic nutrients.
You don't even notice the learning.
You are internalizing the difference between taken and kept. You are absorbing the conditional threats of Mrs. Gray, all while you were just trying not to hide under the covers.
And that is the ultimate takeaway for anyone trying to acquire new knowledge. Context dictates retention. A simple story, constructed with fundamental building blocks, can make abstract foreign concepts absolutely unforgettable if the emotional stakes are high enough.
It really is a staggering piece of design. So to pull back and look at the journey we've been on, we started with a mundane, everyday scenario of a couple moving into an apartment with surprisingly cheap rent.
Right.
We explored how the author used restricted beginner vocabulary to build visceral dread through stark visual contrasts, triggering our evolutionary fear of disease.
The dead grass.
Yeah. We unpacked the physics of auditory intrusion and why a music box implies an invisible, intentional intelligence. We analyzed how a harbinger uses polite modal verbs to establish immutable, deadly boundaries.
This is Gray's warnings.
Right. We examined an entity that subverts horror tropes by acting as an emotional parasite, feeding on love rather than malice. We witnessed the incredible biological restraint of characters who chose to walk away from a predator rather than run. And finally, we saw how the act of bearing witness can offer a small measure of warmth against a 60-year-old supernatural stasis.
It is a profound amount of narrative, psychological, and linguistic heavy lifting for a beginner English lesson.
It really is. But before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one final lingering implication drawn from the text that I want you, the listener, to mull over. Something that builds on the rules of the house, but takes it in a much more unsettling direction.
This goes back to the nature of the entity's food source.
Precisely. We know the entity feeds on love, warmth, and happiness. And Mrs. Gray was explicit it didn't kill the White family, it kept them. It kept them exactly as they were on the night of November 14th, 1962, sitting down for a warm family dinner. But think about the logistics of that stasis. If the entity requires their happiness as a sustainable food source, does that mean the White family hasn't actually aged, or suffered, or even realized they are trapped?
If they realized they were locked inside a supernatural trap, they would feel terror and despair. Despair is cold. It is the exact opposite of what the creature consumes.
Right. So to keep its food source fresh and producing warmth, the entity has to keep them happy. The horrific implication is that the White family might be blissfully frozen in a perpetual, infinite loop of a perfect 1962 family dinner.
It's mind-bending.
They are experiencing the warmth of passing the potatoes, laughing at a joke, feeling completely safe and loved over and over and over again for 6 decades. They aren't victims being tortured in the dark at all. They might be permanent, completely unaware exhibits in a supernatural museum of happiness.
A museum of happiness curated and maintained by a parasite.
So I want you to let that thought sit with you. The next time you sit down to a perfect, warm, flawless family meal and everything feels just a little too comforting, a little too safe, just ask yourself if you're the one enjoying the warmth or if something unseen in the room is quietly feeding on it.
What a note to end on.
We started this deep dive talking about how bedtime stories are like warm, familiar blankets designed to make you feel safe. Just remember, sometimes the thing pulling the blanket up to your chin isn't trying to help you sleep, it's just trying to keep you exactly where you are.